Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Thoughtcast at the Hindu, the show that brings you in-depth views and analysis based on the opinion pages of the Hindu. I'm Narayan Lakshman, Senior Associate Editor and Opinion Editor of the Hindu and anchor for this show. In this episode, we will be basing our analysis and discussion on Earth Day, which we covered with thematic articles on April 22nd, marking the event. Of course, at the Hindu, we interpreted Earth Day to be a wake-up call on climate change. In this episode, we'll be looking at multiple dimensions of climate change, beginning with the most recent Supreme Court ruling on climate change in terms of the right of us, all citizens of India, to have protection from the deleterious impacts of climate change. We will be looking at heatwave projections made for the entire Asia region in terms of what impact it could have on livelihoods, on employment, and much more. We will also be looking at how algorithms can be used to project future droughts and floods across the region. And finally, we'll be touching upon the critical issue of water management and why it matters in the context of the water, food, land nexus, which together again has an enormous impact on the economy and on the way people live and make their livings in this country. Joining me in this second episode of Thoughtcast will be Jacob Koshy, Deputy Editor and a journalist who has covered science extensively. I will be engaging with him in a discussion, bringing out all the details on this very nuanced subject. Thank you for coming here, Jacob. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Narayan. It's a pleasure being here.
Great. And April 22nd was Earth Day. For us, of course, a good opportunity just to remind our viewers and readers of the importance of climate change and the fight against it and the attempts to mitigate and adapt. And so on that occasion, on our opinion pages, we, of course, had thematic articles across both sections of those pages. And we took a very in-depth look at multiple dimensions of the fight against climate change. And here to talk about many of these and look at different ways in which we can slice the problem, Jacob and I are going to have a little discussion on the subject. Okay, so Jacob, let me just ask you first, you mentioned earlier to me the WMO report that came up. Can you, like the World Meteorological Organization, and can you tell us a little bit about specifically the predictions regarding Asia? Because frankly, looking at what it said, it seemed quite concerning in terms of the impact that we should expect.
Yes. So thanks, Narayan. So the WMO report for Asia actually was like a synopsis of a similar report that the WMO had released at a global level, and this is the WMO report in 2023. Now they have been. What generally happens is that around the annual climate conferences, the WMO also releases a State of the Climate report, and it updates it, over the months ahead. So what this report essentially talked about was that Asia as a landmass, and if you consider the oceans around it, that the rate of warming is double than, let's say, when you compare it from 90 to 2023, and if you compare it to a period to, let's say, the 1960 to 1990. So whatever warming happened in the 90 to 2023 was double that of 60 to 2023. So that was one standout feature. And of course, Europe also accelerated at a similar rate. North America and South America slightly slower, but given the enormous amount of population in Asia, and given the kind of agricultural systems and people that are dependent on livelihoods, the impact naturally is expected to be great. I mean, Asia has a much bigger range of climate geographic zones. You have the terrestrial systems, you have coastal systems, and you have the most amount of people who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So but another problem with Asia in general as a whole is that the amount of data in terms of historical climatological data that is available in terms of how glaciers are being impacted, how sea and ocean systems have been changed, you only have data from the 1900s, for Asia, whereas for Europe and for the other continents, you have slightly more longer data, as well as a better climate monitoring network, research network. So one of the concerns raised is that, going over time, Asia, surprisingly, given even though it has got so many people, and we are the most vulnerable to this, uh, there is less actual data on on the extent to which climate change effects are being monitored. So this report also highlights we should have better monitoring systems, better data gathering networks, and science to be able to get a much better handle on how the extent to which this region is being affected.
Okay, that's really interesting because while the problem of impact is obviously a serious one, there is a prior problem in a sense of just knowing what that impact is. So could you shed a little light for us in terms of India's own attempts and what infrastructure has been put in place to monitor specifically a climate change impact,
Yes.
like in the realm of, let's say, temperatures or even the flooding? I don't know, you take your pick, but how savvy are we with the latest scientific thinking and the methodological approach that is required to measure this?
So I would say, the India Meteorological Department continues is the is the repository of all things climate and meteorology in India. I mean, it's been 150 years, and they are the one organization that has been collecting right from the from the European colonial times, that has been collecting data regarding India, and increasingly the larger our Asian neighborhood also. So, but there has been some fundamental changes in the last 10 odd years, and the IMD primarily has been geared towards monsoons because it was set up in the colonial traditions, and its main job was to essentially apprise the government of the chances of a drought, and how it would impact revenue collection. That was why it was set up. But and even until recently, and its main role actually is geared towards forecasting the chances of a drought or floods in India. It's annual. It has got multiple forecast. It has a whole forecast system in place to predict and regarding this. However, in the last, I would say 10 or 12 10 15 years, there has been a greater thrust within the organization itself to not limit itself purely to monsoons. It has started to see that the climate, it has started to see the connection between monsoon and climate, how oceans affect the monsoon, and through with this there's this larger consciousness that you have to look at how climate in general is being affected. Of course, monsoon remains mainstay, so they have even shifted the kind of the forecast system. There was a time when the IMD collected stores of historical data and associations between various meteorological factors. For example, how is European snow cover in March? They have created correlations over time showing that how when snow cover is let's say below a certain value, it corresponds to increased monsoon over India, and vice versa. So there are all these 16 and 20 parameters that they have collected over time. But over time, it turned out that most of those factors were not really reliable. And now there's a whole different approach to forecasting, which is much more which is the global standard. So that is dynamical forecasting. This is thanks to the advent of extremely powerful computers, where what you can do is you can simulate the weather on any particular day, and you can create the appropriate physics equations, and it's almost like a game, where you completely simulate the conditions on any particular day, and you just run the model on a computer, and it will tell you what the weather will be like on any particular day you want. Logically, it stands to reason that the further you go out, the more uncertain it becomes. But your forecast for, let's say, 1 week or 15 days is fairly accurate. Now this is very useful information, because from as far as monsoon is concerned, agricultural systems, they prefer information. I mean, a farmer wants to know, okay, will there be a approaching a thunderstorm? Should I be sowing my plants now? They like that kind of operational information rather than a 3-month long forecast. So that is getting increasingly popular. But these same systems are also now able to, they had for the first time last year, we used some of these models in the IPCC, forecast reports. The IPCC puts out, at periodic intervals. And to that extent, there is more modeling of, for example, our glaciers, what impact is happening on glaciers. Most importantly, what is the role of heat waves? How certain parts of a country are, more vulnerable to heat waves. And of course, the biggest concern, which is like of sea level rise. We are also modeling increasingly, for instance, why we are having increasing episodes of, for example, spring is pretty much disappeared in many parts of, especially the northern and spring. You go through extreme winters and it's straight away very hot. Now, why is that happening? There is a climate link to it.
Yes.
So increasingly we are kind of the IMD too, and now there are also several other private forecasters, because these models are essentially open source models, and IMD is a public organization, so you can actually take many of the data sets and run it yourself and tweak it according to your business. So weather is also now a very big private business in this sense. So we are kind of keeping up with with the rest of the world using these new approaches. But as I say, Indian weather, tropical conditions especially, are fairly hard to simulate compared to the more temperate, the weather in the temperate regions like in Europe and America. And monsoon still is still a huge challenge, and is both in the scientific forecasting sense, as well as actually adapting to it. So that's pretty much how it is right now.
That's really interesting, Jacob. Thank you for shedding light on that. I want to pick up on one point you mentioned, which is also specifically relating to water. So, one of the articles we carried on Earth Day was looking by CEEW writers, think tank in Delhi, looked closely at what they call the food, land, water nexus. In the sense, water can be a driving factor for a very wide range of sort of knock-on effects that it has on even unemployment, agriculture. Yes. And therefore, in that article, they talked about moving from almost a disaster relief or panic mentality when you are faced with water shortages or floods, to having a far more planned and controlled approach to the extent possible, to the extent the resources allow us to build the necessary infrastructure. Where do you think we are in that cycle of actually gaining control? Because let me take our own home state of Tamil Nadu and Chennai as an sort of case study, anecdotally. We constantly go between floods and droughts, and despite the government promising, for example, stormwater drain clearing and so forth, there is always some other kind of apparent mismanagement up the line. Let's say with the dam water management, which leads to flooding. And of course, like I said, there's a nexus with land and land mafias who build into water bodies and then damage the drainage system completely for the city. So there's obviously a cycle which is partly sort of structural and natural, but partly, human activity has caused terrific distortions. So can you give us a sense of where we are as a country, or even specific cities or states on that in that cycle?
Yes. So this whole cycle of scarcity and plenty is actually the biggest conundrum of the Indian monsoon itself. I mean, it is this. I mean, we get this. We have a figure called what is called an 87 centimeters is considered normal monsoon rainfall in India. Is considered normal monsoon rainfall just between June to September. But 87 centimeters is just an average number. It doesn't capture the thousands of millimeters that fall in one part of the country and near drought conditions in another part of the country. So it is this, the monsoon, and for whatever is, I mean, it's how it is built. It is unequal in its distribution, and it is this challenge, that both science and and the government has been trying to to square for hundreds of years right now. So but what we are seeing is the fact that this is unequally distributed is already very well ingrained into political systems, into the economic systems. So most cities everywhere are are undergoing massive land transformations. I mean, rural regions are becoming rural urban, and urban cities are becoming even more dense, where fewer people are concentrated into smaller regions, and that is that is accelerating unequal demand. That is, you at the end of it, small small urban metropolises continue to draw even more resources from the larger countryside, or and by extension the forests and all of our natural systems. So I think that this it is, governments always have to play this balancing act. I mean, we recently where we read in the papers about this extreme water crisis in Bangalore and Karnataka,
Yeah.
and several of our colleagues have done these extensive reports, detailing how it's happening. But on the other hand, you have people also say that well, my part of Bangalore is fine, I don't seem to have a problem. It's all in this it's all in the regions where the IT sector has been has come up in the last 10, 20 years, and they are, so it kind of ties into this. I mean, as population movements keep growing and booming in regions which was once barren, or which was less stress, you are finding these kinds of problems. The same thing, I mean, the traditional solution to all of this, and which independent India actually conceived, was the creation of dams, as Nehru called dams as the temples of modern India, because it was believed that once upon a time that you build these big enough dams, and through a process of civil engineering, India's water crisis would have been solved. But hey, we are in 2024 now, and these matters still haven't really panned out, because now there is already because of the larger environmental movement, there is a reluctance and much popular opposition to the idea of big dams itself. People talk about smaller water conservation structures, plus the experience with dams, because these are widely seen as avenues for corruption, and they still do, because most of the dams never get built up to the scale that they're supposed to. You see a lot of public money gone, and people still complaining, hey, where's the water that you promised me? So infrastructural challenge, the challenges were already known as sense, but as I said, the fact that this is going to be an unequal distribution has already put in a political economy in its, to where people are being opportunistic. Everybody tries to get what they want for themselves. Now, I don't see how. I mean, yes, we all make the right noises, and we have the right intent to kind of create a more equitable space for everybody. But I still see that very much as a work in progress. And unless we have a much bigger, larger environmental consciousness, and that I think it must reflect in politics, because even in 2020, we are heading to the elections now. I mean, I still don't see any particular party having any particular environmental agenda, environmental statement on what they will do for the environment, or what specifically are they going to work towards conservation, or at least be bold enough to admit that there are certain parts in an environmental economic trajectory that have not always been idle, and we need to make some shifts. These are not, I don't see any political party, major or minor, paying even lip service to this. So I think unless and until political consciousness reflects popular demands to one extent, so I think we are still far away from from being achieving a state like that, but we can always hope.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, Jacob, because what you said about political economy in particular, because it becomes an almost individual or a micro level conflict over resource allocation. The same political economy that you have in the marketplace, for example, or elsewhere, applies to climate change mitigation adaptation effects, or moves to renewable energy. So one of the pieces we carried on Earth Day was also looking at these sort of issues of equity, in the sense when you have, for example, large solar farms, you have to have land sometimes the size of one of the Indian states to be commandeered for this purpose, and often they are commons. They are owned, they are used by tribal communities or by pastoralists in those
Yes,
areas. And so there's very acute questions of social justice that apply here. And
absolutely.
it would be, I would be interested to understand how other countries that have gone through this transition have dealt with it. So, for example, obviously in the West, those are developed economies, they have more resources per capita and are maybe
Yes.
able to kind of allocate them in a manner that without violating this social justice, you're able to take the climate change agenda forward.
Yes.
What can we learn from maybe other countries, or what have we ourselves done? Have there been any good examples of where we've done this and mitigated the conflict as well as climate change?
Well, I would say one of India's. So let me just go back to the question of dams. There was a time when, as I mentioned, we tried building big dams, but what happened was that dams inevitably led to huge questions of rehabilitation, because many people had to be cleared out of their own homes, and that fueled a lot of protests. Because I mean, many dam projects have been successful in that they have successfully relocated people and they have adjusted to new places over time, but that has not been the recent experience in the last couple of decades. But on the other hand, it was these lessons that we learned when, for example, we embarked on something like Project Tiger, because it was in the 1970s there was this wide consternation that in the thousands of tigers that roamed in India suddenly seemed to have disappeared, and we were down to just a few thousand. And we embarked on this actual exercise, where we instead of seeing forests as just a place for timber and other resources, they created uh, parks, tiger parks, and this whole concept that there are within large, with several thousand hectares of forest, there are regions that are supposed to be inviolate. You must be connecting one park to the other park in such a way that tigers can have free, unimpeded movement. You brought in these ideas, but that too involved huge questions about relocation, and especially these are the tribal communities. And there are, and to this day we actually have uh, you know there's a lot of friction between several forest dwelling communities and the government bureaucracy, which wants to kind of control forests, and but at the same time impeding on people's access to land. So I would see, I'm not, I mean, in general, the Western experience, I believe, is not generally accurate, playable in the Indian circumstance, because I believe many of these issues regarding, clearing vast tracts of forest land, for agriculture or, for other, non-forestry applications. I mean, for example, take a country like the United States. I mean, many of these were done during the early years of, American colonization. I mean, because they took away land, and that time there was nothing like an environmental consciousness. So,
Yeah.
by the time the questions of Aboriginal rights, etc., were being discussed, the cities had already developed to where they were, and the forests were, as they are. Plus, India also has a far more restrictive, has a unique situation where we have several tribal as well as forest development communities still living very much within the confines of forest. And they too are very much now absorbed into the current, capitalistic, economic framework that we generally kind of have, adopted since the 90s. And they too want material benefits of,
Mm.
the typical jobs and, good hospitals and good education. So many times the fight, or the discussions, disputes are not really about whether many forest dwellers want to continue to live within forest, and follow traditional ways of livelihood. Several of them want to be compensated adequately, if at all they are losing their land, in a way that their livelihood isn't completely upstaged. So this is the complexity of the current kind of thing. And in one way, yes, we can extrapolate it all the way to the discussions that happen in the annual COP conferences, where the Western countries are generally, and they themselves admit that they are responsible in large way for the huge amounts of carbon concentrations and the extremely unequal levels of per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And India continues to exert its right, saying that the developed world has built itself on unequal carbon consumption, so we should have a chance too. So again, this is a developed versus developing conundrum, but as we are seeing the last decade per se, there is a general consensus now, whether it is India, China, or the Western countries, that no country can get an absolute free pass on emitting carbon dioxide. The realization is pretty much stark that we all have to move towards ending the era of fossil fuels and shifting away to non-renewable sources in a much bigger way. Of course, it's not happening at the pace that it is supposed to, and that brings with, I think opens its entire new complicated, can of worms in terms of the kind of land availability that we need for solar parks, as you earlier mentioned. So even I just like to say in closing that it was actually the Supreme Court, recent Supreme Court ruling in India, equating human rights and climate change. It was very commendable one. I mean, interesting in one way, because it actually put human rights over wildlife conservation. I mean, one of the takeaways was that yes. Was that solar parks are necessary because they are renewable energy, and we need solar parks, but we need it pretty much over the precedence of this creatures called the great bustards. I mean, yes, we must conserve the great Indian bustard, but it cannot be at the expense of limiting solar parks and access to solar energy, because that actually affects our human rights vis-a-vis the climate change problem. I think that was a very seminal kind of ruling. I don't know what kind of implications it will have in the future, but I'm guessing it will, but perhaps not immediately.
Okay, that was going to be my next question to you, because I guess the court ruling also it raises questions about what is called a just transition from where we are now to where we plan to get to, and within that all important question that you just highlighted, which is the value judgment behind human life and protection from climate change versus the value we assign to other non-human species, which certainly have their own inherent sort of merit. So anyway, that's interesting. So let's wrap up there. I think Jacob, you've raised some fascinating points. We started with looking at the WMO report and Asia, in particular, in terms of the heat waves. I think you highlighted very clearly the diversity of populations and geographies, and the impact could be very, very significant. So something for us all to watch closely. And then we talked about monitoring systems. You explained a lot about the algorithms that are used for projections and how that can help with regard to drought prediction, for example, which again raised this question about water itself and management of water. As we've all seen in different parts of India, we have a surplus and then drought, and it sort of all boils down to better management, better infrastructure creation, and that all important point you made about the political will behind getting that done. And then, of course, we tied up with some questions about social justice and the political economy of this. And finally, that epochal almost Supreme Court decision on climate change rights as such and protection from climate change effects. So anyway, Jacob, thank you. That was a very detailed and multi-layered discussion that you really brought up.
Yeah, I mean, all of these topics are, our entire huge discussions in themselves.
Yeah, there are PhD theses waiting to be written on every one of these. But you've done a great job just highlighting this for our viewers and listeners. So thanks once again. We'll wrap up here. I'm Narayan Lakshman, Senior Associate Editor at The Hindu and Opinion Editor, and I'm anchoring ThoughtCast, which you're watching now. Look out for more episodes on our website, www.thehindu.com, and we'll be bringing you more of these fantastically analytical and deep conversations on the topics that matter. Thank you. And thank you again, Jacob.
Thanks, Narayan.
Take care. Thank you so much for joining us. Please continue to visit www.thehindu.com for more on ThoughtCast and other video and podcast series. We are very excited to be bringing you these stories and conversations, especially on the eve of this election, and looking forward to much more. Of course, that includes your feedback, shares on social media, and let us know what you think. Thank you.